So my point here is that this was not a specialist enthusiasm. That is, it wasn't just like me being excited about this temple as a personal enthusiasm, but rather many, many people really wanted to know what these capitals looked like because it was part of current ongoing architecture. It was not a recherche thing, it was not a matter of studying the past, but it was a matter of utility, of using these things for ongoing buildings. So this is something that was very, very practical and something that was being put into use. It was also subject of quite a bit of laughter and parody. And here you see a famous print by William Hogarth, who is making fun of James Stewart and Nicholas Rivette. In fact, he even depicts Athenian Stewart as this blockhead. You know, the word blockhead means this thing made out of wood that's going to support a wig. And so it says here, the Athenian measure, and they put a compass on top of James Stewart's head, represented here as a wooden block. And he's talking about the 5 orders of periwigs. And so he's really making fun of the idea of having an elaborate project like Stewart and Rivette, so detailing all of the orders in precision that way. There are also some political undertones to this as well. But it's very, very humorous to see how he's taken this idea of labeling everything and describing it in great detail, but mocking it in the form of these wigs, which were used for the coronation of Queen Caroline right about in that time. This is all around 1760 or so that this was published. Now then, I want to show you some specific examples of how Stewart and Rivette's work had an impact outside Athens. And I want to begin with the Tower of the Winds. This is their view of the Tower of the Winds. And notice that the ground level at that point came about 3/4 of the way up to the door of the building here. And again, they anticipate the kinds of work that we do today by describing in some detail the excavations that they made, including very precise observations of how the walls were aligned with each other in the trench. They had to dig down on 2 sides of it in order to get the entire height of the building, and in order to get all of the details of the base and the sides of it here. So they had to excavate from about this level on down, and they describe it in their book. So they actually did some archaeological work, as well as the fine measurements of everything that you see today. Now that wasn't all. James Stewart, after his trip, the trip lasted for 3 years between 1751 and 1754, went back to England. Their book was not published until 1762, as I said, but they got all kinds of commissions from their friends, especially members of the Society of Dilettanti. And here, at an estate called Mount Stewart, which was the home estate of Lord Castlereagh, the famous diplomat at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. This was built by his grandfather, and it was designed by James Stewart himself. And you can see how it's modeled after the Tower of the Winds. Today, it's used for weddings. So the day that I was there, they were there preparing for a wedding on the inside. But when it was originally constructed, it was meant to be a place where a bachelor could entertain his friends. And in fact, the guide who was there told us stories about people being brought up the back stairs here in order to be entertained in this garden structure here. The inside was also designed by James Stewart and is absolutely gorgeous, with the ceiling inlaid parquet floor and a fireplace with the neoclassical motifs here. Now the coloring here, which is authentic as far as they can tell, might remind you of Wedgwood. And I wanted to comment that Stewart and Rivette were also, in large part, at their work, in large part responsible for propelling forward the whole Greek revival movement well into the 19th century, that included not only architecture, but fireplace decoration, as I showed you here, interior designs, and then also things like Wedgwood pottery. What you're looking at here are two very handsome examples that were designed by John Flaxman, a sculptor, and were actually fired by Josiah Wedgwood himself. And this has been imitated quite a bit. I think even in the placa you can find little magnets and so on that are base descendants of this. But at the time, this seemed new and fresh, and I just want to comment that this scene that you see here was actually taken from one of Sir William Hamilton's pots as well. So these things have a very long history. It was not only dishes and fireplaces and interior furnishings, but also costume and particularly ladies' dresses that began to take on a rather neo-Greek look in the late 18th and early 19th century as well. So when you see those Jane Austen movies, think about the interiors, the clothing, and so on, that all has a sort of a classical feel about it. That all began with Stuart and Rivette pushing the whole British society forward back into a sort of a Greek revival. Now, in Ireland, quite near Mount Stuart, which is just south of Belfast, there is a small village in County Down called Kirkcudbright, and I just happened to notice this church, which actually has not been particularly well studied, but we do know that it was built in 1843, and the architect has been named as Sir Charles Lanyon. And you can see it looks die-style and antis. It might make you think of the Athenian treasury at Delphi, but actually, it turns out, if you look at the details of the anticapital here, and the measurements and proportions and so on, it is a virtual replica of another building that Stuart and Rivette measured, which today we call the Temple of Artemis Propolia at Eleusis. And today we reconstruct that temple as being tetrastyle, prostyle, but they thought it was diastyle and antis. They also thought it was 5th century, and I also am very suspicious about the Roman date that's usually given to that temple of Eleusis. I think it would repay investigation. It may actually be an older building, perhaps from the 5th century, that was brought into the Roman period to be used in its present place. So I think we can identify with fair precision here the actual antecedent inspirational drawing, one of Stuart's and Rivette's that was included in their 4th volume after they died. This one was published, but this was work that they carried out at Eleusis. Now then, the most famous of all probably is the Lysicrates monument, and I show you their etching here of the Garden of the Capuchins with the Lysicrates monument built in. This is where later Lord Byron came as a guest, and also supposedly the first tomatoes in Greece were planted in this garden here in 1818. I read that somewhere as I was reading up for this, which is interesting to think that there were no tomatoes in Greece before 1818. But here they were in the Capuchins' garden. Now you see it as an isolated monument here today, but because of their drawings that followed this one that were very precise, like the Tower of the Winds, it became much admired and much repeated. So here, for example, in London, in the Holy Trinity Church that was one of the Waterloo churches, after Waterloo, the government decided to set aside some money for a whole series of churches to be built. This is no longer used as a church, but it was originally called the Holy Trinity Church, and you can see an homage to the Lysicrates monument perched on the top here. There are many such buildings that have this. And not only that, it spread to the United States through the transmission of Stuart and Rivette's book. And here, for example, we see one of a series of paintings by the Hudson River artist Thomas Cole, in which and they're absolutely enormous paintings, he visually describes the course of empire. And he begins by showing you an early primitive landscape that gradually gets built up. And here you see it in its pinnacle with a round monopterus here on top of a larger building, on top of a Parthenon-esque octa-style facade here, one thing on top of another. This is meant to represent empire at its peak. And of course, it's a commentary on America of circa 1836.